known Alan Kay for a long time. He's a close friend who was at Xerox PARC in the 70s, or 60s and 70s. And you'll be happy to know that he says, we invented everything that's in place today. It was just better then. So we're only catching up to a lot of the innovations that were put in place from the very beginning. So, one of the questions I think someone said is, to what degree would this happen right away? I mean, execution perhaps is not maybe our greatest strength. But there are some interesting pieces. I think to that end that talked a little bit about, I think it was before, if we looked at some of the information, not the shock piece, but the question around sort of major transformation in the business world, combined with, if we think about this notion of the information that more people can get. So you talked a bit about what's amazing is a lot of this, in the last piece you mentioned a lot of this, there are pockets of excellence in things we've always done, the actuarial world, and this combines a couple of things. What we found is that it is now extensions of that in terms of what's possible. So it was part of, we actually wrote a paper based on some models that we've been working on that around this notion of policyholder behavior modeling and its implications on product design. And in essence, just like everything else, a lot of these disciplines, a lot of things that have been around for a long time, behavioral economics is one that's been around since the 70s. Daniel Kahneman and others, it's now gotten huge notoriety and publicity. I mean, I could plot the number of books about the topic that have come out now. It's amazing how much progression that it has made. Books like Nudge and Predictably Irrational, and a number of other things. But if you combine that with the other techniques that have actually, when complemented with sort of, we work a lot with our actuaries on, is around agent-based simulation modeling. So if I look at a granular level of policyholders, so for the U.S. market, we actually have a household view of balance sheet and cash flow. And so when I look at what the effects of certain things could be and how they make decisions, the question would be what are sort of the range of things that could actually happen, combining what that can mean from a pricing, reserving, hedging. If in the U.S. market, the huge problem of variable annuities and what that created a few years ago, lapse rates were much higher than one would expect. Because what happened was people were behaving around certain ways. The unemployment, it wasn't about their individual unemployment, it was about all the unemployment that may be around them and the effect that then had on how they reacted to where they are, and what does that then do to sort of the products. So I think, like in many cases, what you'll see is it's a lot of those techniques and things that have been around that now either the computing power has allowed you to do it, so systems dynamics, agent-based simulation modeling, that allow you both the aggregate to evaluate all of these interdependent variables that we couldn't look at, combined with the ability to operate it at instances. So when I say agents, in this case, I mean an instance, in this case a customer perhaps. How each of them sort of respond given what we know about the individual, and see the range of potential outcomes. And like anything, and this is probably, I think, the wisest thing said is if we've learned anything from sort of what happened in the financial industries, you don't black box it. It's never about, it's not about the science. It's just not just about the science. It's not just about the art. It is this notion of how do we combine the art and the science to arrive at least to look at what's sort of combine our intuition with what degree can we narrow sort of the set of things we may want to look at and what that could be. And I think that's where I think you see a lot of really interesting things occurring, and not trying to make things like quantitative black box like we saw in some of the other financial services space. So I like the talent piece. And then you said how train execs and actuarials for their interpretation to respond to the consumer demand. So related to that, I think one of the things I mentioned was sort of this, I think there's this notion of cells. I think traditionally we've separated the various pieces. So when we drive sort of data, it's either an IT-led thing where somebody in IT will gather the data, will look at it in different ways. What big data is something like Hadoop, but something like the different technologies, and they'll look at different things, and they'll come up with something and hand it off to a business user in some cases, or the actuarials will look at something from one lens. And I think what becomes really interesting is how do you create sort of these multidisciplinary cells that are evaluating those things collectively. So when I talked about sort of the edge of the network, can you create sort of these combination effects that are literally doing the folks who have great intuition are your best underwriters, your best actuary with somewhat of a data scientist who maybe some of the newer techniques or the ability to actually explore, look at that data, take mass data and pull up things on the fly. So what would this mean? What would that mean? And I think as we start to see that evolve, it's not that everybody has to understand how to do it. I think it's how do we actually combine sort of those multidisciplinary teams in new ways. And I think that's something we haven't really gotten into in terms of what that can mean from productivity. Where did we get to? So much was said. So major transformation in the business world. The question was really around sort of global, social, mobile. Aren't they forcing companies to react differently today? Don't we already see some of these big changes? Is it really possible that we could see entirely new companies? And I think what's interesting, one of the things I didn't mention, but if you went back, if you just look at companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon, if you took the standard industry classification code, they don't really have a SIC code, right? They don't really they don't really map to any given industry that we've had today. People throw them into high tech potentially, but how does that resonate with? We're going to get it. We're looking at the car business. How does that look? How does it resonate to Google's? In many ways, started to enter insurance. Right? They bought an aggregator in the UK. They're looking at what their play is in various forms. They look at it as, we have an intelligence platform and talent. What do we do with it? And money. What do we do with it? It's an interesting thing. So what does that really become? I think what will be interesting is, and you said, would there be anybody that's global? A lot of the things that have opened up, the ability, maybe you said customers would define what those companies would become. I think there is a place. What's interesting to me is if you looked at how sort of capitalism formed, initially it was on sort of what we call sort of speed, on a speed dimension, so niche, a small niche, do it very, very well. And then you had the huge sort of aggregated stock companies, so the GMs became huge scale plays, all integrated, virtually integrated together. I think the model that's possible today, and it will be interesting, if you look at any of the global insurers, they're really multi-local currently. If I had to look at them, they're not really playing on sort of a whole huge scale. But the question would be, can someone actually be a combination of speed and scale? I used to say that, if fast beats big slow, big fast beats everything. But how can one really create this notion of big and fast? The aircraft carrier analogy I use is somewhat the model I was trying to get at with that. Truthfully, it's actually become more of a network economy. So, even that's, you could extrapolate that probably a little further as well. But I think you're absolutely right. You'll see very different structures of these organizations. And it's hard to say that there's an exercise we do with companies called the fiercest competitor, which is really to say you've been removed from. We tend to look at our strategies biased by our current constraints and capabilities, and as such, we say, how do we do what we're doing a little bit better, as opposed to if I stepped out of that. This is an exercise I used to do with. It was with the U.S. Navy. The notion being, if you didn't think you had a lot of competition, could you actually know yourself better than how would you destroy yourself? What would you actually create that could look at you in a different way? And in many ways, it was taking these dimensions we talked about and saying, if I really went to the extreme on some of them, it's kind of what you did when you said, if I took a true global, social, mobile, customer-oriented, would they structure it all a different way, and would it operate a different way? If you can come up with that, the question would be, what keeps somebody from being that, or what elements of that would be useful if we were to do that? So I certainly don't have an answer other than I think that the major transformation in their business world, I think we're seeing it in huge ways. In different pieces. I'm jumping around a little bit from the questions, but it's where is it? There was the question on if able to form a model that create a shock. Could you, let's see if I get this right, could you take any one of the dimensions and use it to shock the whole, or are they all sort of interdependent? Was that, I can't remember, was that kind of the point? Hard to do. I spend a lot more time working on systems dynamics models, which actually, try to take all the different variables and play them together. I think it certainly is very hard to take any one of them. I do think one that can create. I think the one that can create the biggest difference, and we've talked a little bit about it, is the technology piece, but specifically around the information set. And the reason I think that it is, again, it doesn't supplant I think it amplifies your talent. So I think the combination of the talent you have, those who have the best sort of artists, if you will, the best sort of intuitors and understanding that piece that you talked about, and can amplify it by how technology can actually do some things in different ways, I think can create sort of a learning curve effect that makes it very difficult for others to replicate. And I think that's driving some of the most significant change. Like all the things different from what you said were happening in 73, then to 83, and then to now. In most cases, that's been because it's not so much that the patterns weren't known or already sort of uncovered, the opportunities to use it to its fullest have become more realized. And that's continuing to change. I mean, I mentioned the genome sequencing thing. I mean, who knows what that holds, but that's a pretty powerful curve in its own right. And then consumers. So we went to the health one. Consumers more demanding, more prepared. How do you empower health consumers? What's best for them? Yet there's a balance of the restrictions of getting data from the patients and the like. I think what's interesting is, and it's got a long way to go because there's huge resistance to it. But two things. So one, it was the CIO from Kaiser Permanente in the U.S. who's done a lot about sort of the integrated health. Kaiser's unique in the U.S. to the health system because they have a fully integrated program, provider insurance, and the network. And what's really interesting about that is, so they're talking a little bit about everything we do today in the medical is very much around we treat when a symptom occurs, versus the notion that people are actually doing more things around the preventative side and what that can mean. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And there's a notion that you couldn't really, there's restrictions of getting the data from the patients. I think where change will occur, and you're already starting to see a little bit of it, is where patients are willing to provide their information. So if they're willing to share it because there's a mutual benefit, you'll start to see some things happen. And that's obviously that will only be a small number of the population. And the question becomes, if we sort of model the curves, to what degree does that behavior change? Where do you reach sort of that tipping point of when people sort of say, well, that's just expected? I think that's sort of a planned behavior. And you're starting to see a lot of that in the wellness programs that are happening. And I'll use the U.S. Example. They're trying to drive things that are much more behavioral oriented, and I don't know how many you have, if these are prevalent here, and I maybe don't even have mine with me. My my little Fitbit. I mean, this is a little tracking thing. Just tells me how many steps I get, and today I've not had nearly enough. But there are tying things into that and what's there. Additionally, there's a lot of thinking, a lot of work doing around reputation systems. You talked about where people can sit, and I've seen some things with. I know the American Medical Association was looking at how they do that. There was an online place called Sermo, which was looking at, I don't think it's around anymore, that was looking at reputation systems of doctors. There's obviously a lot of resistance to that in some forms. You'd see the same thing around reputation and from other forms, but that becomes a really interesting, how will reputation systems evolve over time, I think becomes a really fascinating piece. And then one thing, I think one of the very first questions was around how do you see the evolution of the ability to capture and use more data and information. I think this is interesting. The stat I had showed that said 75% of executives believe it could create a competitive differentiation. I also presented, there were about 100 and some C-level execs at a presentation, and I asked to what degree does information create a huge difference, and they said, extremely. and then said how many feel really good about their ability to use the data they already have, and nobody answered. So I think it's interesting. I think every organization, certainly every insurance company, has great pockets of excellence. I mean, our actuaries are very good at understanding how to use data and different purposes. And the question becomes, how are we expanding that? If we really look at how do we really look at the use of, if I think about the decision processes in an organization, who's really tasked with looking at both the sort of the cycle time of that decision-making and the effectiveness of that decision-making on a continual basis, knowing that there are new sources and new techniques that can be applied. And then it's not a technology answer, we need to build a data warehouse. It's not just an analytic exercise to say, let's pull it all together and do a one-time discovery and study. It's the combination of how those work together to discover, act, and then monitor, and look at that across all of those different pieces. I look at something like the customer life cycle, and everybody plays a part in that. Distribution, the product, marketing, service, but each one of them is looking at the information from their own lens in different ways. And oftentimes what you have is a little bit of a battle internally around who's really got it right, as opposed to how are we actually thinking about that sort of across the silo. And right now, there's not often somebody in an organization who really owns how we're actually looking at that in many ways. And I think that's one of the first steps toward how we'll actually improve our ability to use it. And then this notion of insurance is quite conservative, reaction may be slower. How do you see the characteristics of the companies? There's a notion, a colleague of mine has been doing, I think it's maybe the first ever sort of study on self-made billionaires, and it was looking at the traits of their success and how might that apply within companies. So a view really on talent and how you sort of drive talent and sort of break through innovation and disruption. And one of the things he came up with, has evaluated, is this notion of there are producers and performers. And the challenge in an organization, it's not that any one of them separately can be effective, it's how do they work together. And the challenge is a lot of organizations know how to recognize the performers. We're very KPI based, we drive everything down to have we done exactly what's there, and oftentimes don't know how to recognize the producers that can create some things that may break out. And themselves may not get those things done because performers make it happen. The example he uses, if you see an acquisition that happens of a company, we'll take that Climate Corp example, let's see what happens with it. Does a layer of performers then project on them some operation that basically you see them leave, and you see what actually created this great amplifying effect possibly disappear. So how do you create that notion of talent sort of within your organization? I think that's going to be a key to sort of success here. With that, I will stop.
Ouvindo o Jamie falar, eu lembrei de ano passado, uma grande empresa brasileira reuniu a cúpula ali dos seus executivos, meia dúzia de executivos, para ouvir um especialista nessa área, fazer essas projeções todas e tal, e deixou todo mundo ali, todo mundo ouvindo, prestando atenção no que ia acontecer, toda essa revolução tecnológica e tal. No final, era uma reunião fechada, não era um seminário, eram poucas pessoas. No final, o principal executivo da companhia fez a seguinte pergunta para o palestrante: eu queria saber se isso tudo vai acontecer antes da minha aposentadoria ou não, porque faltam 5 anos para me aposentar. Assim, são enormes os desafios, essas discussões são muito interessantes. Eu acho que assim, vocês estão de parabéns pelo alto nível dos palestrantes, das discussões que foram colocadas aqui. Acho que foi muito importante, muito rica. Eu tenho certeza que todos nós estamos saindo daqui com muitas reflexões, muitas ideias, um pouquinho de medo, né? Mas muitas ideias principalmente. Eu quero agradecer, nosso tempo encerrou, não podemos estourar mais. Quero agradecer, parabenizar todos vocês, agradecer a oportunidade de participar desse encontro. Obrigada, Rossi.
Bem, chegamos ao final do primeiro dia de apresentações e debates. Nós temos um encontro amanhã, 9 da manhã, para darmos continuidade à Sexta Conseguro. Eu convido a todos agora para o coquetel, que será oferecido pelo IRB e pela CNseg no Pavilhão Brasília, fica no subsolo desta casa de eventos. Por favor, a nossa saída aqui em frente, tá? Tenhamos todos uma boa noite e nos veremos amanhã às 9h em ponto. Obrigado.